What number are we up to then? Nearly 300. So yeah, let's make a start. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to our 5th webinar, which is Reflective Supervision, Ideas for the Virtual World. So as usual, this is being recorded, and no, it's not on YouTube yet. It is being recorded. All you need to do is just relax, take notes if you want to, but you don't have to because it will be on YouTube. Interact with us in the chat, get yourself on Twitter, #StudentConnect, and then just interact, just relax and soak it all up. So what we'll do is we'll introduce the team, including our special guests for tonight. So my name is Kelly. I'm on the social work course, the BA at the University of Bradford, nearly at the end of my first year. I'm literally counting down the days. So I will pass over to the team. So first up is Emma. Can you introduce yourself, Emma?
Hi everyone, my name's Emma Grady. I'm a second year MNSW student from Edge Hill. I'm studying mental health nursing and social work. I'll keep my eye on the Twitter account with Becky tonight, so if you want to get in touch you can give us a message on Twitter. Thank you. Excellent.
Cheers, Emma. Next up we've got Omar, in real life, in the flesh.
Hi everyone, my name is Omar. I'm a BA social work student in my first year at the University of Birmingham. I'm part of the technical team, so if there's any technical problems just throw them in the chat and I'll pick them up.
Excellent. Cheers, Omar. Next up, we've got Chris. Are you ready to introduce yourself, Chris?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Chris. I'm a third year student studying with the Open University. Just finished my placement. So yeah, exciting times. I'm going to be looking at your Q&A tonight. So any questions that you might have, pop them in the questions and answers, and we'll try and get some of them through to Siobhan.
Excellent. Cheers for that, Chris. Next up, we've got Becky.
Hi, I'm Becky. I'm in my second year at the University of South Wales in Newport, doing the Bachelor of Science in Social Work, and I'll be with Emma doing the Twitter and Instagram with a little bit of help from my mate behind me.
Thanks. Cheers, Becky. Next up, we've got a special guest tonight, Rosie.
Hello, I'm Rosie. I'm an engineering student and I'm going to be doing some drawings tonight.
Fantastic. Really looking forward to seeing those. And then we have our extra guest tonight, Bridget.
Hi, I'm Bridget Caffrey. I'm one of the lecturers in social work at the University of Chester, and I've been working with Siobhan on developing this reflective model.
Fantastic. Brilliant. So we'll pass over to Siobhan. I know that a few of you have saying in the chat that it wasn't spotlight in the video, and a lot of people really want to see Omar because they haven't seen him before, but maybe we can see him a little bit later. Brilliant.
I'm here. I think if I talk, you can see me. Oh, is
Yeah.
that showing?
Yeah.
There we go. Cool. Hi everyone.
Fantastic. Excellent. So if we hand over to Siobhan and we'll get started, and we'll put ourselves on mute just in case there's any sound issues. Over to you, Siobhan.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Kelly. It is lovely to see Omar in the flesh because we normally just have his photograph, don't we? So tonight is going to be all about reflective supervision, and we're going to look at this from ideas for the virtual world, because many of us now are working from home or working at home or living at work, whatever we want to call it. But we're going to look at how can we do supervision in virtual spaces, if you like. We've got two special guests with us, and we're going to tell you a little bit more about them and why they're here later on. But I know that people love the analogies that we use, so tonight we are going to be looking at Sesame Street as our background for tonight's webinar. And the reason for that is it doesn't matter whether you know about Sesame Street or not, because whether you've watched the programme or not, but on Sesame Street they would often start it off by saying tonight's programme is brought to you by such and such a thing. So tonight's Wednesday webinar is brought to you by the number 2. We're going to be thinking about the 2s in supervision. So we've got 2 guests joining us. There are going to be 2 parts to the session. We're going to explore 2 forms of supervision because we're going to be looking at individual supervision as well as group supervision. I'm going to take you through 2 specific tips for reflective supervision. Tonight, rather than the student spotlight that we normally have, 2 students are going to step up at one point in the session. There's going to be 2 of us in conversation later, and there are 2 possible uses of tonight's session. So we know quite a lot of people who are coming tonight are practice educators or supervisors. So you're going to be wanting to look at what you get from tonight's session in terms of how can you support and provide reflective supervision. But there's also still a lot of students coming along tonight, and you might want to use tonight to think about your own supervision and how you can meet, if you're in England, how you can meet PCF Domain 1 about professionalism and use of supervision, and PCF Domain 9, which is all about leadership. You could take some of these ideas back and maybe use them in group supervision with others, or take ideas back to your own supervisor. But equally, you could use some of the ideas we talk about tonight just to improve your own reflection and build on what we talked about in last week's webinar. So that's why tonight the webinar is brought to you by the number 2, but that's because supervision is a 2-way process. It's a really important aspect of supervision. You know, sometimes people will say to me, oh, I don't get good supervision. You can't say that, because supervision isn't something that happens to you. Supervision is something that you take a full part in, an active part. Both people, the supervisor and the supervisee, have to prepare for supervision. It's a 2-way process. So that's why we have the 2 here. The other reason for the 2 is that working in the virtual world, we're really effectively addressing 2 different situations. You've either got, number 1, working with someone who is completely isolated and very much on their own, or you've got number 2, where you're working with someone who is trying to manage their own childcare, do a bit of homeschooling, be online, do all of the other things that are involved, and is just overwhelmed by everything that's going on in terms of working from home. So we've got a poll come up here about how you see yourself. Are you isolated and alone at home in your work, or are you busy and torn between lots of roles? So we've got the poll going on at the moment. I know some people have been telling us in feedback a couple of the systems that you join on don't show the polls. So normally I don't say how many people have voted and what the vote has been, because I think people can see it. But tonight I'll tell you what that vote says in a moment. So we've got 65% of you feel like you're busy and torn between lots of roles, but 36% of you, it's moving up and down a little bit. I know that goes over 100%. 36% of you feel isolated and alone at home. And actually, supervision is essential for both of those. If you're feeling isolated and alone at home, supervision is essential to help you feel connected. But if you're busy and torn between lots of roles, supervision is essential to help you think about how you manage your work in amongst all of that stuff that's going on around you as well. So 2 different situations, and we're going to do 2 things. But the next thing that we're going to do feeds into, again, some chat. We do try to respond to everybody's feedback. And last week, quite a few people asked about the drawings and the images that we use on the PowerPoint slides. So I talk a lot in social work about us being on a journey. All of us in social work are on a journey, and the journey analogy is a really good one for us to use, because we talk a lot about journeys for the people that we support. So a child's journey through placement, for example. In mental health, there's a lot of talk about recovery journeys. We talk about signposting people. So we use the journey analogy a lot in social work. We also use the journey analogy a lot in learning. People talk about being on a learning journey, for example. So I'm involved in learning and development of social work. So of course the journey analogy works really well, because it sort of bridges both social work and learning and development. So I talk a lot about the learning journey, and I draw on that in my work, and I've developed some specific methods out of that, and that's what we're going to start off with the webinar tonight. I'm going to share some of those methods that I use in individual one-to-one sessions. But when I say I draw on it, I don't do the drawings. My daughter does the drawings for these sessions, as we said last week. So when Rosie introduced herself and said, I'm an engineering student, you might have thought, why is Rosie here? Rosie is here, even though she's nothing to do with social work, because what we're going to try out tonight is Rosie is going to do some drawings specifically for you. So in the chat box tonight, think about your journey as a social worker. What does it feel like for you at the moment? What's your journey feel like? And if you can put that into a few words in the chat box, Rosie will try and draw for you what your journey is like, and we'll share some of those drawings with you on social media and so on. And if you wanted to email me and ask if your drawing's been done, I'll try and email the drawing to you as well in the next couple of days. So tell us about your journey. A couple of examples. You might recognize this drawing from the webinar we did on the pandemic, but that might be what your journey feels like. It might feel like you're in a boat trying to paddle upstream, and there's holes in your boat at the moment. I don't know, it might feel like that. It might feel like this. Your plan might be very structured and very clear, but in reality, actually what you're facing is bumps and bridges and twists and turns. So you decide, put some words into the chat box, and that's what we're going to do. So we're testing out something new tonight, some live drawing as we go through. So we're going to start off with, I'm going to share, as I said to you at the beginning, two specific hints that I use, two specific methods that I use. So if you've been attending the webinars regularly, you'll know we've talked about what's a model and what's a method. So the journey model that I use, I have some specific methods that I've drawn out of that. In fact, there's lots of methods that I use. So in the image earlier, actually, if I go back and show this image, I noticed Rosie had drawn the passport that was being held by the person. And that's because I talk about supervision as the passport for your journey, because you can go on a journey without a passport, but you don't get very far without a passport. So I use a lot of methods and a lot of the analogy when I'm thinking about supervision, but there's some specific hints and tips that I'm going to share with you. One is about how I open reflective supervision, and the second is how I close a reflective supervision session. I've been using these methods for years, but I'm currently using them in the virtual world, and they work really well in the virtual world too. So my first practical tip is use a postcard to open reflective supervision. It really helps you to track a journey. Now, postcards are, there's an art of postcards. A lot of people don't send postcards anymore. Years ago, postcards were flying around all over the place. Nowadays, you don't get postcards so much. But I remember as a child, I never went on a holiday as a child, but I used to go on 2 day trips a year, one to Southport and one to Blackpool. Very excited as a child to do those things. I can see Kelly laughing because we grew up in a similar place, so that's probably a similar experience. But I remember being really excited about going into a shop and choosing a postcard that I could send home to grandparents about where I'd been. And it was only a day trip. I loved sending home postcards. And if you remember going on holidays and sending postcards back to say, here's where I am, I'm having a great time or whatever, often the postcard would arrive way after you got back, but it was a way of communicating your journey to other people. So it's an old-fashioned way, if you like, of communicating a journey. And over a number of years, I started to collect postcards that I could use in supervision with students. And then I would ask people, students usually, as a practice educator, to bring a postcard to the beginning of supervision. So if you provide supervision, you'll be familiar with this. You start off supervision with, how are you feeling? And you get something like, oh, I'm really busy, a bit stressed, or very busy, or I'm all right. You don't get very far with that. And opening supervision with a discussion about feelings is really important. And I think particularly at the moment, when we're working with people in that very isolated situation or that incredibly busy scenario, we need to really open supervision up on an emotional context level. So I start things off with, I still say, how are you feeling? And I still get that same kind of response. But then I'll say, okay, let's go to your postcard. And the student will share with me a postcard that says, here's how I'm feeling, my journey is going this week. And then what we do is we look at that postcard each week, and at the end of the placement, we track the whole journey through the postcards, and we're able to see how did the journey go through the postcards. So I'm going to share with you on the next slide one student's journey through her placement in postcards. And I've got her permission to share this with you. But this is a photograph of the postcards that she brought to supervision each week. So if you're starting up in the top corner there, I think that postcard is taken from Monsters Inc. actually. I think that's where the image comes from. But it's like a little girl prodding a big monster. And this is what the student said in her first, very early part of supervision. I think it was the second supervision, actually, because I normally introduce the postcard idea in the first one. And she said, this is how I feel. I feel like I'm having to prod people to ask them questions all the time because I don't know what to do. I'm having to constantly ask, what do I do now? What should I do with this? Why am I doing this? And constantly prodding people. But that led us into a really interesting discussion because I was able to say, well, actually, the monster doesn't look that scary. They look like a bit of a friendly monster. Is that how it feels? How are people responding to your questions? So what you can do with the postcards is the person talks to you about why they chose the postcard, but then you explain perhaps how you might see the postcard differently. And then I'll just take you quickly through what the person said about the postcard choice. The next week, she bought the ABC postcard. She said, I feel like I'm really right at the I'm having to go right back to the beginning of learning. I'm right back to the beginning of ABC. This was a student who had a lot of pre-course experience, but still felt like on that week, I've had to go right back to basics. The following week, she bought the postcard there of the bird, and she said, I feel like I'm learning loads of things, but what's happening is I'm learning pieces. I don't know how all of this is going to fit together to make social work. So I've got all the pieces in place, but it's not really fitting together for me yet. And then the following week, she bought the Three Little Pigs postcard. Now, I remember we had a really lengthy discussion about this postcard, so I won't be able to do it justice in the conversation, in what I say to you now. But one of the things she said was, she was working in a children's team, and she said, I remember having this book read to me when I was a child, and I remember reading this book to my children when they were younger. And what I've realised this week, she said, is I've learned that we can't apply our own parenting standards or our own experiences of being parented when we're thinking about assessment of parents. And that was a really interesting point. She also talked about the bridge. And she said, I feel like I've moved across the bridge from the university into the placement setting, but the river's moving very quickly underneath me because time's passing. But then the key thing here was she talked about how much she'd learned about risk. And the wolf hiding behind the tree, she'd been doing quite a bit that week about risk assessment. And she said, I've learned lots about risk and how risk can be hidden, and we don't necessarily, it's not what we think risk is. So there was a lot of really interesting discussion there. The following week, we just had her mid-placement meeting, and she knew she was on target to pass. So she said, oh, it's lovely, I can lie back and reflect, and I'm feeling much more relaxed now. But by the time I went the following week, she's throwing bits of paper around everywhere, and we all can identify with that postcard. She said, I've got so many bits to do for my portfolio and for the placement. And then the next week was the ants carrying the little ants carrying big things. And here she said a couple of things. She said, I feel like I'm really part of the team now, like I'm part of an army of ants. I've moved into placement. I really feel like I'm part of the team. But also, one of the things she said about this postcard was she'd had some feedback from a child about a piece of work that she'd done, which to her was something very small, and she hadn't even considered it. but she was talking about how a tiny ant can carry something really big, and what she realized was something that was very small to her meant a great deal to a child that she was working with. And then the final postcard there, you probably can't see it that well because it's my photography skills are not very good, but she said, I feel like I was on a journey, but I've taken a bit of time now to come. She said, I had a particular view about where I was going to go in social work when I qualified, but now I feel like I've had to get off my bike, look at the map again and think about, is that the direction I want to take? She said there's lots of, the signpost there has different arrows going in different directions, and what I've learned is social work can take you in lots of different directions, and the windmill in the background represents the fact that there might be some winds of change in terms of how I feel about where I want to go. So very quickly, you know what that student's journey through a placement felt like in those pictures. And it's a very visual way of demonstrating your progress through placement. Now, there's a lot of research, which we'll look at when we come to looking at analysis, but there's a lot of research around why the use of visual thinking really enhances reflective skills and also analytical skills. So using postcards with someone at the beginning of supervision, even if they're not a visual thinker, it can help to develop their reflective and analytical skills. But the most important part of the postcard choice is the way the other person sees the postcard. So here's some feedback from that particular student who chose those postcards. Actually, that postcard choice, that placement is many years ago now. It was actually the first time I used postcards to track a journey with a student. But this is what the student said about it. She said, I found choosing a weekly postcard really helped me to reflect honestly. It helped me to tune into and prepare for supervision. I've been able to express my feelings and emotions through a wide range of images. For me, looking at pictures, I thought they were able to represent my feelings and my learning at that point in the journey, perhaps more than I could in words. In addition, the postcards gave me a platform from which to discuss any issues, and by sharing the postcard at the start of supervision, I felt Siobhan was able to prompt discussion about how I was feeling, and in some circumstances help me to see things differently. In that very short paragraph, the word feelings and emotions comes up 3 times. The thing about these postcards is they are really good at helping us to express emotions and to provide emotionally supportive supervision. But it's that bit about how does the other person see the postcards that matters. So to show that, I want to share with you a story about how different people see different things in the same postcard image. And this is a postcard that I had for many years. So for quite a long time, I was doing this postcard activity and I was gathering postcards from all over the place. And this postcard that's just appeared on the screen now, I know exactly where I got it. I got it when I was at a conference one time, and it was just in a pack of postcards from a charity shop. And I brought it home and I unpacked this pack of postcards and I thought, goodness me, whatever am I going to do with this postcard? Whatever is this postcard going to represent to anybody? And for 3 years, I was taking this postcard with me all over the place. I've used postcards in training and conferences and lots of places. And no one picked this postcard. In 3 years, it was never chosen. It was probably the only postcard in my whole collection that was never chosen. And then one day, in a really large group, I saw somebody pick up this postcard. And I had to listen in to what they were saying because I thought, I've no idea what they're going to say about this postcard. So I was trying to listen in really carefully. And this is what the person said. She said, I'm a newly qualified social worker and I chose this postcard to represent where I feel I am now. She said, when I started my job, I was told that I'd be given a protected caseload. She said, what I think is protected and what my manager thinks is protected, we might as well be speaking to each other in an entirely foreign language. On the back of the postcard, it's all written in a foreign language. And she said, because what I think is protection is not the same as what my manager thinks is protection. She said, when I was a student, I felt like I was really safe and I was really protected by my practice educator. She said, in fact, you could think of my practice educator as being like a giant condom that kept me protected from everything. She said, now that I've qualified, I feel like the condom's burst and I could be spreading all kinds of viruses. My practice might not be safe anymore. That's what she said. And when she said it, I thought, you know, that's really true. I can totally see what she says about that postcard. But this is what the person next to her said. She said, when you turned that postcard over, I had no idea what I was going to say about it. I have never in my life seen a green condom with feet. She said, but now that you've said that, I realise what you mean. She said, and it makes total sense. She said, but what I think is, I think that you might feel a little bit green, a little bit new in your job. She said, and in a way, you're taking your first steps into the profession of social work. She said, but actually, I really don't like social workers. This is what she said, and she said it exactly like this. She said, excuse my language, but I don't like social workers who are too cocksure of themselves. She said, what I like is social workers who have professional humility and know what they don't know. They're not cocky about themselves. They know what they don't know, and they will go and ask. And she said, and to me, that sounds like just where you are now. So that's a really safe place to be as a social worker. So that helped that worker to see her situation in an entirely different way. So this is why these are so good. They're also useful in direct work because basically you're talking to people about emotional context. So you can use postcards in a whole range of ways. But in terms of supervision, I open up supervision with the postcard, but I make sure that we show growth and progress across the postcards. They also work really well in group supervisions for people to share the postcard. So everybody in the Social Work Student Connect team this week has chosen a postcard, and I think over the next few days we're going to share on social media the reasons that they chose it. But because tonight is brought to you by the number 2 students in the team are going to tell you about their postcard choice, what they chose and why they chose it. So we're going to go over to, I think it's Kelly that's going to go first. So she will take her mute off and tell us about her postcard choice, which you can see there on the screen.
Excellent. Yeah, so first off, I had no idea what to pick, and I picked about 10, narrowed it down to 10, and then narrowed it down to about 5, and then 3, and then up until about yesterday, I was absolutely convinced I was going to talk about 2, so I've narrowed it down to 1. So yeah, my postcard is, I'm just going to look at it now because I can see the bottom of it on here. It's like, I don't actually know what it is. It's like loads of pieces of iron, like I don't know, maybe like Siobhan can tell me later what it actually is because I don't really know. It's like loads of pieces of iron, like bits of steel, I think, like a little bit of rope, bit of blue rope, bit of green rope, blue and orange rope. And I think for me, what it kind of said was, there's like a lot going on. Do you know what I mean? There's loads going on in the picture and it's not really clear what it is. And for me, that kind of spoke to me about me doing social work, that I kind of went into it thinking it was one thing. I thought, well, I've kind of had lots of experience working with children and young people and families, so I'll probably go down a child protection route, maybe like a fostering route, something like that. But I've got on the course and thought, wow, it's like so much bigger than anything I thought it was, and there's so much like involved with it. So kind of like a few of you have said in the chat, there's so much that you can do, and I never even considered that. And I think like for myself, like in my own personal life, one thing that the kind of course has been really good for is exploring my sense of self, like my kind of who I am as a person, like how I see the world, where those views might have come from, all those kind of early influences, and how like the way you see yourself affects the way you see the world, and then the way you see the world affects kind of how you deal with people, how you work with people, and all of that. So I think kind of like understanding where you've come from. So yeah, for me, that was why this postcard was really relevant, because it kind of looks it looks like one thing, but then it's not one thing. There's a lot going on, which is pretty much me, really. Like, people, what they see me as, sometimes there's a lot more going on, and then it's up to me as a person whether I let people in on that, kind of what I'm thinking, or whether I just be the person that everybody thinks I am, which is the person to get people talking, get people laughing, get people chatting, or whether I kind of step out of my comfort zone and, you know, be myself, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's me. Somebody's just put in the chat, it's an intertangled mesh of strands, but with patience and time we can entangle the strands and find the end. That's, yeah, I might quote you in my next essay. That's good, that.
See how different people can see things in a completely different way, Kelly. That's really good. Thank you for sharing that with us. That's really, really good. Thank you for that. I'm going to come back to what you shared a little bit in a minute, if that's all right with you. And then we've got Emma is going to share her choice of postcard with us. I think Emma might have been having some issues getting on earlier, but are you there? Great, thanks, Emma.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's all fine.
Okay, so I had a look through all the cards, and like Kelly, it is quite difficult to choose, but one of them really stood out to me. It was this one. So the name of it is Sunflowers at Singapore Airport. So from the 160, that was my favourite, and I felt drawn to this postcard for a number of different reasons. At the start of lockdown, I decided to grow some sunflowers. I got all that excited, I had loads of spare time, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to grow loads of vegetables, fruit and sunflowers and sort my garden out. So I ordered 20 sunflower seeds from eBay, and they took about 3 weeks to arrive, and they come from China, so I was waiting forever for them. But when they come, I was really excited. I put them in loads of little pots and started, you know, off growing them. So I started to become quite attached to these, and I was checking them every day, I was nurturing them, and I noticed that the ones that I'd left in the smaller pots were obviously not growing as much. So when I saw the sunflower card, I thought, right, okay, so that kind of really reminded me of how I have experienced my social work journey. So we all start from something small before we start any journey, like any education journey. So I was the seed. So over time, like the sun and the rain, the experience that we have and the knowledge allows us to grow. Along the way, there will probably be something like a slug or an odd critter that will damage our leaves. And that slug or critter to me is COVID-19. So it's arrived and it's trying to, you know, destroy us. But like flowers, we can recover and we will continue to grow. So I thought, like a sunflower as well, we grow best in a suitable environment and when we have a good support team guiding us. So our support networks and friends provide the stability and guidance to grow healthy and strong. Now, we'll probably be shaken by storms, by strong winds, perhaps when our exams crop up and different things like that, but our canes and our roots can keep us firmly grounded. Like sunflowers, we are all the same kind of flower, but each flower is individual and unique, and we're all different. Some might have bigger petals, more seeds, some brighter or darker in colour. Some might have more leaves and a stronger stalk, but in the end, we're all the same. We're all sunflowers, but we're all beautiful and unique, and we grow best in a nurturing environments with a bit of support. And I think overall, from growing these sunflowers, I've realised that you can't do everything on your own. You do need a bit of support, and I'm very much a person that will try to, you know, take on the world and think I can do things on my own. And the same with, like, when we started the student hub, I knew that I needed some colleagues to help me, and that's why I got all the students. We can't do everything alone. You do need guidance and you do need support, just like a sunflower needs a support cane. So that was my reason for choosing. So that was
lovely. Thank you very much for that, Emma. So I asked the whole team to choose a postcard, and then I thought, well, you know, I can't ask everybody to choose a postcard and then me not choose one, so I chose one, and I chose one this morning. Left it till this morning, and I often, if I'm honest, I often choose a postcard just to think about how I'm feeling that day or how things are going on that week or whatever. So I chose a postcard, and this is the one that I chose today. So I took a photograph of it just to put there. This is the postcard I chose this morning. And I chose it because I was thinking about the community I think that we have started to develop in these Wednesday webinars. I woke up this morning to an email from someone talking about how much they were enjoying the webinars, and she sent me an example of so Valerie, who I know is here tonight, had emailed me and said, look, I developed my own model of reflection after one of the reflective webinars. And so I was thinking about the kind of community and how happy I was that it was Wednesday today, and because I'm on my own, but I had a couple of things today where I was connecting with Bridget earlier today and tonight. So I kind of thought, you know, I was feeling a sense of happiness, and that one always jumps out at me as a happy postcard. So that was the postcard that I chose. And it was interesting because then later today, just before I came into the session, and I got another email from Amy talking about how she was using these sessions to think about doing peer sessions with other students. So it's fabulous when we hear from you about how you're using these sessions, and this was the postcard that I chose. But as you know from attending these, because we know there's regular people coming back again and again, the key thing that I talk about all the time is connections. And what I would suggest for people is, if you were to choose postcards that represent where you are along your journey, always look for what are the connections. One of the key things that I use these postcards for with newly qualified workers, for example, is I'll say, choose a postcard that represents where you are now, and then choose one that represents where you want to be at your next review, and then look for what connects those and work on that, because you can use the postcards in a range of ways. So the connections between, look, all of the postcards here that the whole team chose and that I chose this morning, and I tried hard not to read too much into what the team sent me about their choice of postcards, because some sent me quite a lot of detail, so I tried not to look at that before choosing my own this morning. There's 160 postcards in the postcard set, and every single one of us, and I haven't said this to any of the team, I don't know if they've noticed it, but we all chose one of the photographic postcards. So there are postcards that have words on and quotations on, there's photos, there's artwork, there's some that are just verbal and there's no pictures on them, but all of us chose a visual, and all of us chose one that was actually real life, not drawn, but real life. And I wondered whether that was something about, we're all so fed up with the virtual world, we want the real world, and we were choosing real world images. I didn't know if it was that. But also what I noticed was 160 postcards, and just the few of us, the postcards we chose were by just 3 photographers. There was only 3 people that took these photos. One of them was me. I took a couple of these pictures. One was my best friend, and one was my best friend's son. There's something about that connectivity of our choice of postcards. So I just thought maybe it's because we've been working together, we've become a team, we've made similar choices, but always look for the connections, whatever those connections are. So that's how I would open reflective supervision. I can't tell you how transformational it has been in the reflective supervision I provide at bringing the emotions really quickly and creating relationships as well in supervision very quickly. So that's my opener. Then how we conclude supervision. I conclude reflective supervision in the same way every time. And I think in just the same way that having an opener is important, having something to conclude a session is also important. So you could use anything you like. I know some people will use a different method every time, but what I find is when you get to the end of supervision, if you provide supervision or you receive it, often it kind of peters out a bit at the end. It's a bit like, is there any other business then? When are we seeing each other again? Are we done then? It's sort of like that almost. So I still do that, any other business, when are we seeing each other again? But then I conclude with the same method every week, every supervision session. I'll say, okay, let's go into our concluding reflections. And that's these. And these are from a particular method of reflection coming from the University of York. So every supervision, I end by saying surprises. And the person I'm supervising tells me the first thing that comes to their mind. And then I say satisfactions. dissatisfactions, learning. They just tell me the first thing that comes to their mind. And this is so valuable, particularly if you're a practice educator or you're supervising a newly qualified social worker, at giving you lots of evidence, because these 4 things help you to both direct the journey and provide evidence of change and development to help you to pinpoint how the journey is going. Because what surprises a student at the beginning of a placement, 3 weeks in isn't surprising them anymore, and by the end of the placement they've forgotten they were even surprised by that in the first place. So it really shows growth, and it gives you lots of evidence to put into your final report. I would also suggest this for those of you who are not providing supervision, those of you who are students who are here. Think about using this at the end of every week on placement. Just jot down, we talked last week about the importance of keeping a reflective journal. At the end of every week, just work out surprises and the first thing that comes to your mind, and then satisfactions, the first thing that comes to your mind. Jot that down because it gives you evidence of growth and progress. It's a really great method for that. So as I said to you earlier, I've been using these methods for a number of years to open supervision and to close supervision in a face-to-face way, but they work just as well in a virtual way. And if you're working with someone who's got all of those things going on, the postcards is brilliant, because what you do is you get the children that are in the trying to manage as well, they choose a postcard or they draw something that can be included as a postcard for next time. So the children feel like they've got something to do whilst the parent is in supervision. So there's lots of different things that you can do, and you can take all of this into the virtual space. But that's the first part of our 2-parter. We're going to move on to look at why reflective supervision is even more important in the virtual world and how we do it. So we're fabulous thing to have Bridget with us tonight, and Bridget and I are going to talk in conversation, I suppose, about a new model, a brand new model of reflective supervision that we developed coming out of the pandemic, really. So if you've been attending regularly, you'll know I've talked quite a bit about the impact of moral injury, and that's why reflective supervision is important, because good quality reflective supervision can help mitigate the impact of the injury. Checking in with people emotionally and reflectively is really important in the virtual world. And it's really important for supervisors to understand how things are going for people with changed ways of working, not just what are you doing, but all of the how are you feeling about what you're doing. Situated learning opportunities, learning from others that are just around you, is more difficult now in the virtual world. We've already talked in these sessions about the loss of traditional reflective spaces that are caused by the way we're working at the moment. Decision making and risk awareness is supported through good reflective supervision, and that's particularly important at the moment because making decisions about risk with pandemic working is really difficult because of sometimes missing information, and change learning and development opportunities as well. So we're going to talk to you, Bridget and I, about the development of a new model of reflection. So I think Bridget will switch her microphone on so that she can take us through, and we'll join going through this together. But we've developed a new model, a brand new model, which you'll not be surprised by the fact it has the word connections in it, because that's so important for me. But the model we have called the University of Chester Reflective Connections Model, so the University of Chester Connections Model. And Bridget's going to tell you about how and why we developed the model.
Thank you, Siobhan. Yes, early on in the pandemic, the University of Chester Social Work Department was contacted by the principal social worker for Cheshire West, the principal adult social worker, I should say. Like most social workers, like many people in different roles really, very quickly everyone was moved to work from home, having to do things very, very differently. And he was aware that people were feeling isolated. So teams had been separated physically, they'd been separated psychologically as well. And there was a lot of change happening and people were having to manage that change on their own. So he wanted to see if there was anything the social work department could do to help them support their social workers. And both Siobhan and I are practice educators. We're very used to doing group reflective supervisions and individual supervisions. And some of the social work teams were used to doing group reflective sessions. But we recognised that very often that would mean one person talking about something in quite a lot of depth. And what we needed to do, because of what Siobhan was just saying about moral injury and the isolation, was we wanted to connect teams and connect people more. And so we thought if we could come up with a model of supervision, group supervision, to be delivered online that allowed people to look more at the breadth of reflection and look for connections between themselves, that may assist and support people in the difficult situation. So very early on, Siobhan and I did 3 sessions as a pilot for Cheshire West, and they went really well. We imagined that we were trying to do something that would kind of be second best for everybody, but it would do because it was a difficult time. And in fact, the feedback was, no, it is different, but actually it's great. And it was what was needed. It was very powerful for people. And we ended up doing a session with every single team in adult social work in Cheshire West. So 12 more teams, 15 sessions in total, which was probably more than we imagined when we started, Siobhan, I think.
Yes, yeah, we'd not planned on doing that number, had we? But they were.
As you were talking as well, it just occurred to me, Siobhan, because I didn't know about the 2 thing tonight, but actually there was Cheshire West and there was the University of Chester that came together. So there was 2 there, wasn't there? And then you and I, of course, did it together. So there was 2 there. So there's other 2s going through this as well. But it is a simple model, and we think online it probably works best if you do something quite simple and possibly a little bit more structured than you might do in other situations as well. So at the very beginning of each session, which lasts for about an hour and a half overall, we get everyone to introduce themselves. We make them turn on their cameras. They're always a bit reluctant, or some people are about that. Introduce themselves, everyone knows who's there, and I give an explanation of how it will run. Everyone takes a turn to present for 5 minutes, and they talk about a piece of work that they've been involved in during the pandemic, using one of 2 models that we gave them to choose from to reflect. We send that information to them in advance, and they choose which one they're going to do, make a few notes. People don't interrupt, they just listen to each other's reflection. And then when everyone's presented, Siobhan, who has been working really hard during that, looking for connections, feeds back the things that she's noticed, and that then facilitates a group conversation.
Okay, so we send out, as Bridget said, we send out people models so that they can prepare for the session. And the 2 models of reflection that we chose to send out to people were head, heart, hands and feet, which is one that I developed based around the head, heart and hands framework from social pedagogy, and the University of York Surprises to Learning one, which is the one that I said to you I conclude every reflective supervision with. So we sent out these 2 models, so they had a choice of 2, and I think actually we decided on doing that at the beginning, didn't we? Because at first we thought about giving 1, and then we thought, well, we'll give a choice of 2. And over the 15 sessions that we've done, both models have been used. What we found, probably the head, heart, hands and feet one has been used slightly more than the surprises, satisfactions one, but only marginally. I'd say both of them have been quite well used as part of the presentations that people have given. And again, I would just say, those of you who are not providing supervision, these 2 are very good, quick, simple methods of reflection if you want to use them for a journal, for a quick sort of reflection, quick reflective activity. So Bridget will tell you why we called it what we called it, and maybe introduce some of the core themes that came through.
Yes, certainly. I just noticed that someone asked if there was a particular size of group, and we asked really if we could work with about 6 to 8 people at a time. We sometimes had significantly more of that than that. We had over 10, 11, 12 even on occasion, didn't we? And we just went with it really. We never stopped anyone from talking, and we made sure everyone had a go each time. But I think probably between 6 and 8 is the best if you can control that. So why did we call it the University of Chester Connections Model? We thought the title reflects that it was all about connections. It developed from the connection between University of Chester and Cheshire West. We're in a teaching partnership along with other local authorities and HEIs, but that has improved our communication, our working together, and I think that's why they contacted us, and we were able to respond very quickly, and the university were very happy to support me to do this, even though it wasn't strictly part of my job, if you like. So I think that was one of the first connections really. But we knew when we were developing it and when we were delivering it that it was important to connect everyone. We wanted to connect team members who had been physically distanced from each other. We wanted to help them look for themes that connected them in their practice, challenges that they were facing, and share those, which people have described as cathartic, but also looking for solutions to that together and recognising the good practice. We were really clear that we wanted people to talk about some things that had gone well and encourage them to see how well they were working, and that they were still practicing social work and doing a really good job. Theory came up in each session. The social workers enjoyed connecting theory to their practice. That's not something that perhaps they'd been able to spend much time thinking about, and this gave them the opportunity to do so. And of course, Siobhan, who is one of the visiting professors at Chester University, connected with us and got involved very much in delivering and developing this model.
So do you want to talk about these connecting themes, Bridget, and then I'll do the next ones?
Yes, certainly. As I just mentioned, we did ask people to focus on positives, or certainly bring up some positives. So, and that was about making sure that people went away feeling more positive and more connected, really. And so a lot of this is positive, and there were also some difficult things. It's a very difficult time, we recognise that, but it was really interesting to hear the social workers very often recognised that the people they were working with, the service users and the carers, actually had strength and resourcefulness, which perhaps we sometimes underestimate. And we perhaps rush to make decisions, rush to get involved, and in fact people are quite resourceful. I remember one social worker talking about how someone she was working with wanted to get a flat with her boyfriend, and this person had a learning disability. So the social worker went to the usual places that a social worker would go to try and find somewhere, and they were all closed because of COVID, so they couldn't get any support from there. So the service user herself went on Rightmove and found a flat just like anyone else would. It was just, it's, you know, people can be more resourceful sometimes and have huge strength that perhaps we get a bit too routinized in our practice and forget to encourage that. Also, I thought it was really interesting that they talked about how sometimes it has become easier to hear the service user's voice. There was less distracting noise. I always think of Siobhan's weather model as well, and it talks about thunder and what is drowning out the sound of what matters. And I think this was really interesting that the social workers were saying there was less other people speaking and offering their opinion. You could go directly to the person. You made the phone call directly to the person. You used your iPad to connect directly to the person through Zoom. So it in fact meant that they were hearing the service user sometimes much more clearly than we often do. They also said that joint working arrangements had improved. Professionals were kind of having to work together more. It was a crisis and everyone was chipping in. There was less protectionist about whose role was this, whose role was that. People were looking for solutions, probably become more solution focused really. And it was much quicker to organise things like a multidisciplinary meeting, which might take weeks normally. Suddenly everyone could make themselves available online in a couple of days. And that was one of the things that they talked about perhaps trying to sustain after COVID is over, because some things have now changed and people have looked at ways that we can work perhaps better using some of the systems that we've come up with. They also noticed how people that they kind of assumed perhaps wouldn't be very technologically minded actually did quite well with the new technology. So people with learning disabilities, older people, actually really comfortable with the technology. Again, sometimes preferred it rather than have social workers coming into their homes. They were actually saying, no, I quite like the fact that you contacted me on Zoom today, that's great. And that made them question assumptions and stereotypes, probably unconscious ones that they hadn't realised that they were carrying, and it brought those to light. There was a lot of complexity in the situation, and it would be foolish to imagine that COVID hasn't made social work more complex and people's lives much more difficult. But actually, a lot of the social workers felt that they were able to see some simplicity and work through things and identify what really mattered. And that again was a positive for them. And finally, I would just say, speaking of reflection as well, the social workers regularly spoke about how they had actually had to start reflecting for practice. So whereas they might be jumping in a car several times a day to go and do several visits and several assessments, they were having to think for each particular piece of work, what's the best way to do this? How can I get around the challenges? And actually reflecting in advance of practice and becoming much more creative and individual, and that seemed a real positive as well.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about some more, Siobhan?
Yeah, there's the use of self was a biggie, wasn't it? Because people had to see themselves on screen. Sometimes we had to persuade people to switch their cameras on. They didn't want to, but I think with a little bit of persuasion and, you know, well, me saying, well, my grey hairs are growing through as well, then people did, and everybody. But you learn a lot more about yourself when you're having to watch yourself on a screen all of the time. There was a lot of creativity coming through in practice. Grief and loss came through, though, very strongly. You know, people in terms of a loss of teams, a loss of contact with each other, a loss of colleague support. And what we felt in terms of that kind of emotionally supportive supervision was that social workers need the space to acknowledge that loss and to have a sense of collective sadness, really, because I think that's important. We need to acknowledge the loss. There's no good being all positive to try and lift people up unless we actually acknowledge the sadness that we feel. Changes to team dynamics, we explored those and used Tuckman's theories about groups forming, storming, norming and performing. And, you know, teams that have been together for years are re-storming when they're having to do everything virtually. That's something that's happening, I think, often. But the big thing, I think, and perhaps the most important thing, which is why we've left it there as the final connecting theme, was people feeling the lack of value placed on social work. There is a definite lack of value, and people really felt that. And I think having reflective supervision and external facilitators of that as well really brought home the value of the work. And both Bridget and I felt that joining teams for these reflective sessions was a real privilege. And we made that very clear to people, that there was a real privilege for us in joining their teams. And I think that made people feel more valued. And that's very important at the moment, I think. And then in terms of our own learning, we learned a lot. I mean, this was right at the beginning of the lockdown that we started to develop the model. And we learned a lot about technology, didn't we, Bridget? Even just how do you switch the camera on and the mic and all that. We learned a lot about that together. It enabled us both to maintain links with practice and contemporary practice, because I'm, as many of you know, shielding, so I'm not going out. So this gave me a way of keeping connected with contemporary practice. We learned a bit about making sure people feel they can prepare for supervision, the vital importance of that. And so we developed a short spoken PowerPoint. So it's about a 6-minute video that people can watch about how to prepare for one of these sessions. And tomorrow we'll send you the link to that so that you can watch that if you want to. And that's not widely available, but we can send that out to people in the email tomorrow. We learned a lot about space and place, which I know we've talked about in these webinars, but the importance of space and place. And also just that whole aspect of vicarious trauma and moral injury, and the need, if you're a supervisor, to take some time after supervision for yourself, really, because you're listening. We were listening to really difficult stories and trauma, and coming out of those, and especially I think for me being on my own, I would come out of those, I'd close the computer off or whatever, and I'd have all those stories in my head, and I needed something to clear that for myself so that you're not impacted and taking on everybody's problems. So that's important, I think, as a supervisor in a virtual. Yeah, sorry, Bridget. Yeah,
I was thinking, because we spoke about this earlier today, and if you remember, I'd forgotten this. I don't know if you had, but when we did the first 3 pilot ones, after each session, you and I probably had a phone call and a chat about how it had gone. And I think then we ended up doing quite a lot more and not putting in the time to do that. We just thought, oh yeah, we've had those discussions, we know what we're doing now, we can carry on. And I would probably say that if people were going forward doing it, having that quick connection afterwards, it was only 5-10 minutes, wasn't it? But it just helped us both offload a little bit.
Yeah, I do think that, you know, reflecting on the learning for us preparing this and a session we did earlier today, it has been the learning for me is that need to take a bit of time. Because you're listening to really difficult things. You can't go online, you know, with virtual working now. We tend to have our diaries packed full. So you go from one thing to another thing to another thing. You can't go from a virtual supervision straight into something else. I think you need space out of that. We also learned about the value of short, equal presentations rather than one long presentation, which is what group supervision normally does. I think this was more powerful for people. The use of self and improved learning, and just the extent that supervision and good quality supervision can have on people feeling valued. And I think I've always known that, but this was reinforced for me, really. So since we did the work together, Bridget and I, we've both used it in different ways. You know, we did the pilot together and the 12 sessions together, but we developed it further after the first pilot. I now, when we went to the 12 full sessions, I started to write up some thematic notes, which kind of says, here are the connections that came out of the session today. And I send those to everybody that was there. They don't have any names in, they just say these were the connections. But that's really useful for people's CPD, because they show all the stages of reflection, because they've prepared before the session, so they've got their notes from that, they've reflected in the session, and then they get the notes from me afterwards and can look back and reflect on the session. It's excellent evidence for CPD. It gives you better CPD supervision evidence, I think. And it was also useful for the local authority to look at what was working, what wasn't working, and so on. You can provide different models and different methods of reflection to choose from. So I think if we were to do the second session with the same team, we'd try different models as well to improve that. I'm doing that when I'm doing these repeated with students, for example. I'm just about to start first group supervision with a group of students tomorrow, and we're going to use this model. But I'm going to get it to the point where the students then start to listen and hear for the connections. So I'll do it the first couple of times, but then they will start to bring out the connections, and I think that will aid their learning. And both Bridget and I have used these sort of hour-and-a-half sessions like this to follow up from training. We did one together jointly today with a group of people, asking them to think about their own self-care, but we used the same prepare and then everybody present for 5 minutes. So you could use these in a whole range of different ways, but it makes it much more interactive. I'm using it when I'm doing interactive training online to get people to present themselves for 5 minutes. So it's a very specific, very simple model of group supervision, but can work really well. So for those of you in the audience tonight who are supervisors, you can try this out. As I say, tomorrow we'll send you out the link to the video that people can watch to prepare. But if you're not a supervisor, if you're a student or you're a newly qualified worker, take the idea to your teams and use it and facilitate it yourself and take it in turns to listen for the connections. So if you're a student and you took that idea to a team, that would give really strong evidence of leadership and use of supervision and so on. So it's a new model. We want it to go out there and be used. We've written a little bit about it in a couple of places. So that's the model. And thank you very much, Bridget, for coming and sharing that model with us tonight. It's the first time we've had a guest, so it's really nice because we've not had a guest before, so that's lovely. And it's also the first time we're going to try something new. I don't know if Rosie is still there, is still connected, or if she's lost her connection from Northern Ireland. I don't know if she'll be able to share her screen. I don't know if we're going to need some help from Omar. But I'm thinking at this point, before we go into the final couple of slides concluding tonight's webinar, whether Rosie is able to share some pictures from the chat.
Yes. Yeah, I can do. I've taken a few things from the chat. I'll start sharing my screen now.
Thank you. Let's see if this works. This sounds exciting.
Hopefully, this is one I was just in the process of doing. Quite said that they feel like their journey's a roller coaster with lots of ups and downs. So that was the most recent one. And then we've also had people say it feels like a road map or a sat nav that's broken and they can't find their way.
Oh, there's the roller coaster. Thank you. We can see we've got a time delay from Northern Ireland, I think. So we saw the roller coaster.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. And what's this one? The sat nav. What's this one?
Yeah, a broken sat nav or feeling like you can't find your way with a map or being lost.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
We've also had a lot of people say they feel like they're juggling or spinning plates, lots of different responsibilities, and quite a common circus theme.
All right.
And then we've had also people saying they feel like they're blindfolded, whether blindfolded driving a car, blindfolded on an obstacle course. Lots of analogies with cars as well about traffic and getting lost and being in dead ends.
All right.
There we go. That's all of them so far.
I love those. Thank you very much, Rosie. I think you might have a new job. You can move out of engineering and come into, I think they call it graphic illustration or something, graphic note taking. So thank you for that. So we'll share those as well, I think, on social media. I think Emma and Becky are our social media team members. They'll share those on social media, but also we might email them out. If anybody saw their own picture there and wants that emailed to them, if you email me, I can send that out to you. Do I need to screen share my screen again, Omar? Is that what I need to do to show the last slide?
You okay doing that? Just at the bottom of the screen, share screen.
Thank you. Is it worked?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. You see, I knew all of this might be a marvellous idea, but it may not actually work.
You've got this.
I've got share screen, then I'm going, is that working?
Not yet. So if you've clicked share screen and then if you click the PowerPoint when it pops up, and then there should be a button to share.
Share, it's that extra button. Has that worked this time?
Yep, that should work. Cool.
Lovely, thank you. I'm so glad you were able to join live tonight, Omar, and talk me through that. Otherwise it would have all gone wrong for me there. So, okay, so Sesame Street then. Why did we start off with Sesame Street? Why has everybody got a Sesame Street background, or some of us have a Sesame Street background? I'm looking at Kelly with Big Bird sitting there behind Kelly, and Chris has got, is it Ernie or Bert? I can never remember which one's which. Chris I can see that. So why Sesame Street, as well as it's brought to you by the number 2? Also, because if in the song, do you remember the song? We almost put the music in, especially for Darren, but actually didn't manage to get that far tonight. Sorry, Darren, apologies to you. But do you remember the lyrics of the song? Can you tell me how to get to Sesame Street? I'm not going to sing it for you because I don't have a singing voice, but that's in the lyrics of the song. Can you tell me how to get there? And actually, people often go into supervision looking for answers. Can you tell me how to do this? Can you tell me how to do that? And almost think that that's what supervision is about. But supervision is about much more than just simply going to get an answer about what should I do next. Reflective supervision should enable people to find their own answers. You don't go into supervision to get given an answer. A good quality supervisor will help you to think and find your own answers. So a good quality supervisor will ask more questions than give answers. If you go back to the what, why, how framework that we introduced in the very first webinar, then supervision, good quality reflective supervision, should be about looking at the why and the how rather than just the what. You know, poor supervision that's just managerial and just very proceduralized, looks at what are you doing, when are you doing that by. The only how question will be how many more cases can you take. You know, good quality supervision will be looking at how does that impact on you? How does that impact on the service user? What does a good outcome look like for that person? Really good quality reflective questions should be being used in supervision. So good quality reflective supervision is built on critical friendships, which really enable learning and development. All of that said, though, I hope that in some ways we have helped you to think about how to get closer to reflective supervision. So, you know, can you tell me how to get to reflective supervision? Well, not in an hour's presentation, but we have tried to give you, here's an opener, here's a closer, and here's a new model for group supervision. So I hope that we've helped give you some ideas, and we hope that you enjoy the journey. I think actually having Rosie drawing those drawings has been fabulous. I was really amazed by what she'd created for us. But in our future webinars, I know people like to know what's coming up. Next week is a very different new way of us doing webinars. We're going to be looking at anti-racist practice, and we'll be looking at specific models, particularly if there's practice educators here tonight. You'll be interested. We're going to look at the Mandela model of practice education in the anti-racist practice webinar. The following week, we'll be looking at an introduction to the art of analysis in social work practice. And then after last week's comments, we're going to have a session on power and empowerment, the theory and practice behind that. And then we are, based on some of the feedback we've had from you, we are going to start looking at some skill sets. So assessment, and especially assessment in the virtual world as well, will be coming up. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us tonight. We've finished around about our usual time because I know people need to get off and put children to bed or do whatever you're doing. So I don't know if there's anything in the chat that we need to do before we actually close up for the evening. Is there anything, Chris or Kelly, that you would think we need to deal with before we close off? Or
no, Siobhan, it just seems to be people saying thank you, lots of ideas for upcoming sessions which we can gather when the chat has stopped moving so fast. We'll have a discussion about that later, and then lots of people wanting links to webinars, links to your videos, so that's gone in, but that's it really.
There have been a couple of questions in the questions. One person wanted to know how we can break the barriers in supervision to address the impact of power differentials associated with gender or class, which could impact the function and process of supervision.
I have a very quick answer for that, Chris. the quick answer is come next week and listen to the Mandela model, because actually that's the best way of addressing all of those issues, because the Mandela model doesn't simply look at anti-racist practice, it looks at relationship-based practice and the social graces and the power dynamics. So come back and listen to next week.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Perfect answer. And there was one other question, which is around how is good quality reflective supervision different from coaching?
Oh, now that's quite a lengthy one. I think coaching is perhaps, well, coaching comes, I suppose, more from what the person coming wants. So if I went to a coach, I would say, these are the issues I want to be talking about, and it would come from there. Good quality reflective supervision is similar. It has a lot of similar aspects of coaching, but it comes from the work that the worker is doing with the people they seek to support. So it should come, the service user's voice should be central within that reflective supervision, and that's very different to coaching, I think. So to me, that's the key difference, is the maintenance on the service user's experience through that reflective process.
Thank you.
Okay. Emma and Becky, is there anything in social media that we need to know about before we close for the evening, or does everything seem to be going all right on the platforms?
Everything's been going really well. I think lots of people have been paying attention and sending us screenshots of what they're eating and drinking while they're watching.
Well, we sometimes use that as our influence, don't we, for the following week.
On with a glass of red wine, I think it was, not a pina colada.
Not a pina colada this time, no. Okay. All right. Thank you very much then. Thanks everybody for attending. Hopefully see you next week as well. Bye.
Bye.